Today, I'm joined by Kyle Adams, account manager at ConvertKit, owner of Kyle Adams Design, and a prolific creator. Kyle publishes a weekly newsletter called Creator Glue, as well as the Dad Made podcast. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show today. And while this show is focused more on professional services industries, I think my listeners will find value in your creative approach, how they might be able to apply some of your perspective to their own podcasting, to their own marketing efforts. Personally, I think newsletters and podcasts go hand in hand. I think there's a lot of untapped opportunity for many professional services marketers, but also just kind of broader in the B2B space to take these two formats, these two mediums, and just kind of use them together. That's mostly what I wanted to talk about today. So I'm really excited to dive in.
Yeah, me too. I agree with you. They go hand in hand. So I'm excited to get into that a little bit more and talk about how podcasts and newsletters, I believe, should be together at all times.
Yeah, I do too. And it's funny, I launched my own educational email course about a month ago. So folks that are listening to that, go check it out. It's called How to Launch a Business Podcast. But I'm also now at the point where I'm launching a weekly newsletter to accompany this podcast. So you've inspired me, Kyle. You've inspired me to start a weekly newsletter.
That's amazing.
Cool. So let's start here. So you run a weekly newsletter called Creator Glue, which is a free newsletter where you share everything you know about building a top quality newsletter and giving subscribers the best experience possible. Can you share with our listeners a little bit more about your newsletter? Maybe some of the topics you cover, the kinds of creators that you help?
Yeah, my focus is very much the experience. So I've just been about experience a lot of my career. My past is in design and illustration and those kind of things. And I've just realized everything I've done in life revolves around some kind of experience for other people, like giving a good experience. And I see that leads to good results, that leads to a quality audience. And so a lot of the topics I'm talking about in Creator Glue are around that general idea, like giving your audience a really good experience. And also a lot of things about the other side of that. You as the person writing the newsletter, how to approach it in a way that doesn't get you impatient, right? Like it's easy to get impatient with it and say, I've written 10 weeks worth of newsletters and not much is happening. And this must just not be working. Like maybe that's not the situation you're really in, but you start to feel that way, or you start to get burnt out because you're trying to come up with a brand new idea every single time you write a newsletter, which you don't really need to do. And so that's a lot of the focus of my newsletter, is just like giving that good experience for not only the people reading your newsletter, but also in some ways giving yourself a good experience with creating that newsletter and building some systems and processes around it.
Love that. And I think those are two key points that are just universal. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. It doesn't matter who your audience is. You need to be able to give your listeners, your readers, your subscribers a good experience. You also need to be able to create a framework for producing content that doesn't burn you out, because quite frankly, I've gotten burned out trying to do too many things, but it's when I find flow, I like to call it flow, where I have a structure, I have a process that I follow, I know what to expect, I know how long it's going to take. And then that makes it a little bit easier just knowing what to expect a little bit versus trying to reinvent the wheel each time, writing a blog and then writing a newsletter from scratch. Maybe you can repurpose that blog post into a newsletter or vice versa.
I'll even test a lot of things on social first. So I'll post them somewhere, just a general idea, like the basic idea of what you have, see how that resonates with your audience. Did they like it? Did they not? What do they comment? Do people reply with things where you go, oh, actually, yeah, you're right. That changes my opinion on this, or that changes the direction I was going. And then I take those ideas and turn those into something bigger, like a newsletter. And then, of course, like the whole process can continue. You can write that newsletter, you can find your little gold nuggets from that newsletter, share those as social posts, see how those go. And the cycle kind of continues. You can you could definitely repurpose things, even things you've created in the past, repurpose those for your audience again. Nobody's going to remember what you posted 3 months ago because there's a lot of other things happening. Even though you think, I posted this 3 months ago, should I send it again? Should I send this email again? Yes, because most people don't remember. There's a lot of new people. I think we stress ourselves out thinking that we have to make everything brand new because somebody's going to come in and go, this is the same thing you did 3 months ago. And that's likely not the case. Maybe somebody will, but that person is the person you want to have on your newsletter, because if they're reading that closely and remembering things that well, they're a fantastic person to have on your newsletter.
First of all, I just want to start a slow clap, because what you just said is I just want to hammer that point home, because subscribers today, they didn't see what you posted 3 months ago. They didn't see what you posted last week. So of course you're going to want to hammer those same messages, or at least repackage those messages in different ways. So I think that is a fantastic point. For those that are listening, if they want to follow you on social media, you're very active on X, I guess. Let's call it X these days, right?
I never know what to call it. Yeah, we'll go for that.
What's your handle so people can follow you?
It's Kyle Adams, ITS Kyle Adams.
Excellent. So folks that are listening, go follow It's Kyle Adams on X, formerly known as Twitter. Great content. And then subscribe to his newsletter, Creator Glue, if you want to learn how to do your own newsletter better, create a better experience for your subscribers, create better frameworks for yourself. Kyle, I'm curious, and I think many of our listeners who may be considering a newsletter may be curious about this too. Where have you found success in attracting new subscribers to your newsletter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few things. One of them is, of course, getting a little bit more specific with what that newsletter is about. I actually learned this from, I don't know if you're familiar with Jay Klaus. He's a really amazing creator. But I don't know why, it just clicked for me at some point. Last time we had Craft and Commerce, which is ConvertKit's conference we have yearly, Jay was there and we sat down for lunch and we were talking about things. And he just brought up the concept of a newsletter being a product. And I don't know why, but for the first time that had I've always thought of it as a marketing tool, like a vehicle to market something and eventually make sales from. But he turned that on his head and he's like, well, it's actually a free product. It's a product. And so I've thought about that a lot. I've kept that with me. And I think treating it as a product has been a huge differentiator, I guess I'll say, of how I approach it. Cause now I'm trying to sell, the newsletter to people almost. So if you think of it like a sales thing and not just okay, well, we might get some leads in from it from a marketing perspective. And you think of it as, I really actually need to pitch this as a product, and the leads come in from that because they're buying this free product, and now I can upsell them. So when you think about it that way, it's a lot like you would bring in leads for other products, right? Things like I post daily on social. To be honest, I'm not as concerned about social. I see social as the marketing vehicle. It's purely there to hopefully I grab some attention, and the ultimate goal is they get on the newsletter, because then they're actually somewhere where I can successfully convert them in the future to any kind of paid offering I have. So yeah, posting on social has been a big thing. Word of mouth, just striking up conversations. And I would argue that the social aspect, like X or Twitter, getting on there and actually interacting with other people more than you even post content is more important, because you're building those relationships. They'll subscribe to you. They'll eventually mention you. Word of mouth very much gets out there. I'm not much of a paid ads sort of person. That's just not quite my approach, because I just really want genuine people to be on the list, which means, of course, I'm sacrificing rapid growth for fairly slow growth by just trying to attract people who are finding what I'm doing and finding that interesting. But that's most of what I'm doing. The other way I'm getting a lot of people on my newsletter is through ConvertKit has a creator network, and that's other people who are making newsletters and they're recommending each other. So building some partnerships that way have really helped me get some more people on the list, specifically with people who complement what I'm doing. I think when you first see this whole recommendation thing, your inclination is to say, I have to find people who do exactly what I do. And now I'm expecting my competition to recommend to me, or I'm recommending my competition. And that's not really the best strategy, in my opinion. It's looking for people who have a complementary thing. Like, I've worked with a lot of food bloggers as an example. So somebody who does desserts, all their recipes are desserts. Find somebody who all of their recipes are about like barbecue or full meal prep or wine pairings or whatever it might be. And then recommend each other, agree to recommend each other, because now the person who's interested in desserts is probably also interested in wine pairings or whatever it might be. Like, they're probably interested in that. So pair up with them and grow your newsletter that way as well.
Just unpacking this a little bit and just like thinking about it through a professional services lens, just because that's what my audience is. About, let's say, like 10, 12 years ago, one of the most common playbooks in B2B and professional services marketing was to create some sort of a PDF asset where people can come and they can download it. And that, but you could think about that as a product. They're downloading the latest benchmark report, or they're downloading the latest research report, or a complete guide to whatever it may be. And that is the way that a lot of these firms, these businesses would collect first-party data, would collect email addresses. But the way that the business environment, the market has evolved, the PDF has kind of gone away, right? You can find the same level of content quality for free on the internet simply by searching and finding the right editorial material. You don't need to download a PDF. You don't need to give up your email address for that. And the reason why I'm harping on this is because of the one point you made, Kyle, is of treating your newsletter like a product. Is it's a little bit more dynamic, and people, if they subscribe to a newsletter, they can consume information directly in their inbox, which is a channel that they're familiar with, instead of opening a PDF and zooming in because they can't see the text on the screen, right?
Yeah, exactly. That lead magnet strategy you're mentioning, like that, I remember when that was very predominant, and I still think there's some value to it, but
sure.
And there is definitely something about having a lead magnet of some kinds with your sign up. But I think nowadays it just has to be something that's actionable. It has to be something that's helpful. And I say this as currently I don't have a lead magnet for my list, which in the past when I was running, I ran a newsletter from 2014 to 2018 and had different lead magnets throughout, but I haven't had one for mine yet for this one. That doesn't mean I won't, but I think when that does happen, it's got to be something that can have action taken on it. It's something that either can be referred back to pretty often and without, like you said, zooming in on like tiny text on a PDF, or it's something that instantly has some sort of results, produces some form of results for the people who are signing up.
Let's shift gears a little bit, Kyle. Let's talk about your podcast. So you launched a weekly show in November called Dad Made, a show for creative dads who like making stuff while building thriving relationships with their families. And as a dad, I love the show. I think that you're talking about some things that men and fathers should be talking about with each other that I don't think a lot are necessarily talking about. And I know that it's not really geared towards professional services firms per se, but I think your experience running the show and then running your newsletter gives you unique perspective on the synergies between those two formats and those two kinds of channels. So I guess let's kind of like start at like the beginning. Like, how did this podcast come about?
Yeah, the co-host on the podcast is Corey Miller. He works with me at ConvertKit currently, but also we've known each other for a long time. We've actually worked together multiple times at different places. We've been friends for, I think, 10 years now almost. So we really just wanted to get back into podcasting. That was like the start of it, was that we've had 2 or 3 podcasts together. One of them was heavily business focused, more on the marketing sales perspective of things. We had another one that was focused on branding, and we had one that was focused on like work from home type stuff. We talked and we just decided we're kind of at a point in life where, from a podcast perspective, we want to have something that's a little more casual, a little more personal, a little bit more pulls us away from what we normally do in our daily work. And we saw that gap that you're talking about, that there's not a lot of dads talking about all these things that I was hearing from other people, even at work. Like, I feel like sometimes people don't understand how it is at home. We just decided to try it out from there and talk through what it's like to be a dad and explore that and hopefully learn from each other through that, and maybe hopefully eventually having some guests on as well and have them talk about their experiences. But yeah, that's kind of the origin of it.
I didn't realize that you did some business podcasts in the past. I would love to hear about some of your experience with that. You said you ran a couple of different shows. Was there one show in particular that stands out that you look back on and you feel proud about?
So the first podcast we did actually was called Invisible Details, and it's nowhere online anymore. It was taken down. But Invisible Details was all about branding, a little bit of branding, a little bit of marketing, like more things in that realm. But really enjoyed doing that show. That show was broadcast live to a business community, and we got to interact with people while we were doing that, which was really cool. It's hard to do that, record a podcast and interact with people live, but it's pretty fun. Yeah, I'd say that's the one that I reflect back on the most.
I'm just super curious. Why was it taken down?
The person who ran it has disappeared from the internet and everything. It's a long story, but yeah, basically I don't know what happened, but they're gone. Their site's gone. Everything's gone. We were partnered up with them to the show was distributed through that site and it's no longer there. So
that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
It seems like you've launched a couple podcasts in the past. You've launched a podcast recently with a close coworker and friend. Have you thought about launching another kind of business podcast, maybe to complement your Creator Glue newsletter or another newsletter you're thinking about starting?
I've definitely thought about it. I think it's difficult to grow a podcast unless you're very dedicated to it. And that's why I've not done that yet, more so because of my situation. Like, I'm working 9 to 5, I have a family, doing this very much on the side, trying to make sure that I'm being very intentional. That's something I didn't really do in the past, and I learned my lesson from burnout. I think that's why part of my content focuses on burnout, because in 2018, I just kind of everything built up and turned into, okay, I'm basically was gone from the internet for 3 or 4 years. It was not completely, my stuff was still there, but I just wasn't very active, and I quit doing what I was doing. And I attribute a lot of that to just having too many things going at one time. So I had YouTube videos, I had podcasts, I had a course that I had launched, I had social accounts like Instagram, Twitter, I think I had a Facebook going, all sorts of different things were happening. And it was just so much to keep up with. And it wasn't turning into a profitable business. It was just a lot of work that I had committed myself to. And that's a long way around saying I want to eventually have a podcast, but I'm being very intentional about if and when that happens.
I totally understand. And I feel you on spreading yourself too thin. I'm the same way. I find myself spreading myself too thin and have to prune the different ideas that I have.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like a creator's curse almost.
It is. Yeah. There's so many things I want to do, but I've found that focusing on a few and being intentional about those is really helpful, even for your audience listening. Having a few highly focused things produces more results, because you start to learn when you're spread too thin and you're doing a lot of things. I think, especially for any business, thinking about, we have to be everywhere. We have to be on all of these things. We have to be doing everything. In a way, yes, it would be nice to be everywhere, but if you're everywhere, you don't really understand and fully utilize one channel of marketing. If I could recommend one, it would definitely be having an email list /newsletter.
I'm sure you would.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about this the other day, and I was like, the value of a newsletter subscriber is more than the value of a podcast subscriber, because you have that email address. You have the ability to start a one-on-one conversation with someone. You don't necessarily have that with a podcast. Now, on the other side of the coin, I would say that an engaged podcast subscriber maybe there's an opportunity to have a deeper connection with them than a newsletter subscriber. But then again, it's okay. So then that just illustrates the value of those two channels working hand in hand. Yeah, because with a podcast, you've got the human element, right? You hear their voice, you hear the conversations, you hear the ums and the imperfections, whereas newsletter's a little bit more polished because you can take the time to edit a little bit more. I'm rambling here. Please feel free to jump in with your thoughts.
No, I totally agree with you. I think as I've thought a lot about newsletters and podcasts, like there's people I work with, even through my role in ConvertKit, who have podcasts and they're looking for like, how do we get people on the list? Because like you said, it's much higher conversions. There's like kind of two ways to look at it. One, it's more conversions to listeners, right? You're likely to get your podcasts out there more. There's not a great vehicle for podcasts, really. You can subscribe to them on different places like iTunes and Spotify, etc. But as far as just getting the word out of like, hey, there's a new podcast episode, go listen to it, I would say email is probably a great mechanism for that. But getting people on that list can be challenging. And so a lot of what we talked about is like, how do we get people onto this list? And I think a lot of it's about what you've already touched on, which is that personal connection, trying to have that personal connection with your audience. And so if you think from that perspective, then there's things you can do. For example, you could record, let's say 5-10 minutes that's not in the podcast. And it's something that it's a question you ask the guest. It's something that you do that turns into a piece of content for the newsletter. So you're not just like, you're giving them something additional because they're subscribed. And so you're like bringing them behind the scenes in some way, helping them understand what happens outside of just the podcast. Because I think a lot of people, when they think of running a newsletter and a podcast, it's like, well, I'm just going to send announcements every week of like, here's the new episode, and that's right. It. And that can work, but to really like keep people there, keep them engaged, get some feedback, it's like, what can you do that's exclusive for that newsletter? And sometimes I've talked to people who feel like that turns into, well, I have to have an announcement for the podcast, and I have to have this other newsletter I write that's unique, and I just really don't have time for all that. But I think you can use your podcast to bring in, you can use your podcast basically to create unique content. Even if that's distilling down what your episodes are about, like creating bullet points of like, here's the main things I took away from the podcast, and like writing something just about that podcast. Or like I said, offering some form of unique, like, here's a clip that wasn't in the podcast that I think is amazing. I'd love to share it with you. I asked this guest if they would tell me about X specifically for you as someone who's subscribed to the newsletter.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I like the idea of having exclusive content just for newsletter subscribers. Yeah, the way that I see it is a little bit different than just like a newsletter that posts a link to a podcast episode and saying, hey, go listen. The way that I mentioned earlier that I'm building my own newsletter to accompany this podcast, the way that I'm approaching it, would love to get your feedback, by the way, is to take the content and then just package it so that it can be consumed natively in email. And yeah, it might be a bit long, right? If I'm editing it down so it's not too unwieldy, and then chunking it up and making it so that it's scannable and skimmable and consumable. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's enough? Is that not enough?
I think it is. I think it's nice to have for sure. And I think, I hate to give the it depends answer, but I think some of it depends on your audience.
Yeah.
Do they want to read things, or are they listening to a podcast because they learn by listening, or they they enjoy listening the most.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I contend that it's going to be a mix, right? So there are some people who prefer to learn by listening to a podcast. There's some people who prefer to read a blog post or an email newsletter. There's some people who prefer to watch video clips and have that spoon fed to them on social media. So that's part of like my whole mantra, is that your audience is going to learn in different ways. And so a podcast really helps you package up your thought leadership and your content into audio, video, and text-based content. So I think that's what I'm trying to do, is walk that walk and have the content be available in those different formats.
Yeah, no, that's a great approach to it for sure. I guess what I'm getting at is if you're viewing the podcast as the main thing, you're going to want to find people who are audio people, right? People who want to sit down and listen to this whole thing. If your goal is to have what you're talking about, which is to have a podcast for the audio people, maybe have a video for the video people, and have something written for the written people, then yeah, I think creating those summaries and like including a link out to listen if they want to is a fantastic way to run a newsletter for sure.
Well, thank you for validating that idea, Kyle. That's really helpful.
I don't know if I was very helpful, but I do think that's a good approach to it. It's far better than just putting, this is what we talked about today, and a link.
Totally.
And maybe a show art or something. Like putting some more effort into the newsletter is going to be helpful to grow it, because why else would someone subscribe? They're not signing up for notifications. They're signing up for something they couldn't get
That's right.
in the actual podcast.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you ever roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty with ConvertKit subscribers and creators and like work with them one-on-one with building out their newsletter?
I haven't yet. That's really what I do for my role, is talk to some of our creators about how to grow and how to use ConvertKit and all of that. So I haven't really explored that in my own personal work, because I'm doing that a lot, but I've talked to people a lot about what they're doing and their strategy and that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, that was my intent, was to ask you through ConvertKit and the different ConvertKit subscribers and creators that you're working with. I just didn't know. I was just curious about how involved you get with them.
Yeah, so I'm typically talking strategy with some of our larger creators on the platform, and it could be anything from, I'm launching something next week, how can I build out an automation for this thing, to, I don't know, how should I approach a welcome series for my list? Like, different things come up a lot, but more strategy is what I'm focused on personally. We still have a support team that can help out with kind of the details of how things work. But as far as building them out and building automations, building systems, those kind of things in ConvertKit, that's a lot of what I'm focused on.
Excellent. I think that for folks that are listening to this who are thinking about starting a newsletter, I would recommend ConvertKit. I am Team ConvertKit. Go out there, sign up for an account. It's very straightforward and easy to use. I've found the automations and the broadcast emails. I'm fluent in other platforms, so it was pretty easy to come onto ConvertKit, but I think first-time users will find it fairly straightforward as well. So Kyle, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on my podcast today. For folks that are listening, follow Kyle on X, formerly known as Twitter, @It'sKyleAdams. Kyle, is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you think would be important for our audience?
Just the concept of thinking about your newsletter as a product. I know we already talked about it.
Yeah.
I just want to hammer that home again.
Sure.
Think of your newsletter as one of your products and not just some marketing vehicle that's out there, because conversions in a newsletter are way higher than they are on almost anything else. You can get a lot bigger conversions through that. So if you think about that, it's worth investing some time and energy into building a newsletter and thinking about it as a serious part of your business.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a media channel, right? And there's all this talk about becoming a media brand these days, and a newsletter is a great foray into that, right?
Absolutely. And it's not relying on platforms, which is
yes,
very nice.
That's very true. I think that's just like a mic drop moment. It's like it's not relying on the platforms. Kyle, thank you so much for taking the time today. This has just been a great conversation.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you for having me on.